Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we're going to return to the arguably dull, but I would argue necessary world of USB drives. And today we are looking at this. This is the SK Hynix T31 Tube. What an odd name, but as soon as we get it out of the box, it becomes abundantly clear why they've gone for that name. They've gone ahead and created themselves a 1TB external USB 10GBE stick here. This is, I know it looks pretty bog standard, it looks like one of those crappy dongles you used to get when you wanted a SIM card that you connected to your phone, right? This is a 1TB external SSD, taking advantage of USB 3.2 Gen 2 or USB 3.2 X1, whatever the naming strategy is. Ultimately, this is a 10 gig USB. So what on earth makes this different from those? We've been talking about USBs for ages, right? And do you know what? Dare I say it? What exactly sets this apart from something like this? A standard USB. Let's face it, this is not exactly reinventing the wheel. What exactly is this bringing to the party? Well, notwithstanding, we've got the accessories, we've got the box, we've got the instruction manual, 3 years of manufacturer's warranty, and we're done. This does bring a couple of, I would argue, slightly unique tweaks to the market. Number one, it's a direct to USB interface. That's right. And I know straight away you're going to go, well, that's the same as that. And that USB, what is that, like 50 years old? Well, USBs like this one, you can get USB 3.2 Gen 1 or USB 3, whatever it wants to call itself these days, 5 gigabits per second USBs that are direct to a interface. But the minute you reach USBs of a higher speed than that, and particularly when you go into 10 gig USB, you hit something of a power problem. The power delivery required for that port to be exchanged into this to deliver that performance speed in a sustained manner long term, it's actually a lot harder than you think. And then you have to have the components inside that can deliver that power. Now, in the past here on the channel, we have talked about docking stations, we've talked about cases, we've talked about USB devices where you can pop in the drive you want to buy. You buy yourself a USB online, you get yourself an M2 NVMe, you know, capable of a few thousand megabytes per second, and you slam it inside a case. The cases are pretty cheap. But the majority of those solutions all arrive like this. They arrive as cases with a cable. They arrive as cases with an external female port where you have to exchange and introduce a USB cable. This completely removes that, and it is a pocket drive. Now, a number of you in 2024 are going to ask, why isn't it USB-C? And do you know what? You're right, because it's good that it's USB Type A. It means you're going to be able to use it in older generation devices. And indeed, if you were going to use this on an older legacy machine to carry data to a new one, USB Type A is probably the more obvious connection in that context. But moving forward, USB Type C is becoming increasingly common. And when we're seeing, you know, the birth of USB 4, the birth of Thunderbolt 3, 4, and even 5 at some point this year or the next, there is an argument that maybe this could have arrived as a USB Type C connection. On top of that, there are USBs in the market right now that you can get that have a USB Type A on one end and a Type C on the other end. Now, they could have gone down that route, but the minute you go down there, you are really introducing some quite complex components. And also alongside that, you would lose out on one of this drive's advantages, which is inside this little casing here. I know it looks like it's going to be one of these bog standard little old PCBs with some NAND cells on it. This has actually got an M.2 NVMe slot inside, which has an SK Hynix Phison E13 SSD inside, a 2242 length SSD. We'll talk about that more during the testing. And although that SSD is capable of reaching speeds much higher than the 1000 megabytes per second that connector there delivers, it also has a pretty decent sustained performance as well. That sustained performance ensures that this drive, although it can hit 1000 megs, it's the idea that it will keep hitting that 1000 megs as more files travel to it, as you've got sustained utilization of this drive with more and more backup files. Now, whether it is you're using it on a NAS, whether it is you're connected to a PC, an Xbox or a PS5 is really up to you. But it's the idea that you've got now a pocket 1 TB drive that gives you that 1 GB transmission there. Now, as for the feel of it, it's a little plasticky. I won't lie, hopefully on screen you're seeing that footage, but it's a little plasticky on the outside. In a previous video, we talked about the SK Hynix Beetle X31, and that's arguably smaller and it uses a traditional cable attached to the rear, and I think for some users they're probably going to prefer that. They're both 10G drives and they both utilise that E13 Phison drive, which means both of those drives are going to be able to get that 10 gig on sustained performance very well, just like we saw when we were doing our testing on that drive in a previous review. I will say, when you look at this connector, straight away, do you know, you may not have already noticed how wide this drive is. Now, yes, the USB connector is standard USB type A, but look at the scale. You're already gaining on top of that drive an additional 50% either side just for that connector. And when I was doing bench testing on a laptop, I wasn't able to utilize this alongside another USB port. It was just too fat. Now, I get why it has to be that fat, because inside there has to be a slight element of heat dissipation. But it is quite a large, wide drive there, so do bear in mind if you've got a close, back of your PC, a cluster of USBs all together, that might be proving problematic there. But the rest of the build is actually quite nice. Despite its slight plasticky feel, I will say it does feel sturdy at the very least. It doesn't feel like there's any wobble to what's inside there, and according to the review documentation that came alongside this, this has withstood 2-meter drop tests straight onto steel plate. It was a weird thing to read in a review guide, but yeah, definitely, apparently it is protected by that. Arriving with 3 years of manufacturer's warranty and arriving at just 34 grams in the pocket, it's a pretty reasonably and compact amount of storage at 1 TB and that kind of performance threshold. And again, because it's utilising that 2242 M.2 SSD inside, that scaling is made even better in terms of the lightness, but still the performance and the storage capacity. But I think what we need to do now is run this through some tests on both a Windows PC and a PS5, because that's the target audience SK Hynix are going for on this drive. So let's hop over to the desktop and start the tests. So here we are on my desktop PC here. We've connected this 10G USB into a 10G USB Type A slot. So we've got 1000 megabytes per second or a gigabyte per second to play with there. Now, before we go any further, it's worth touching on just a little bit more about the build there. So straight away, we booted up Crystal Disk and we can find out immediately, not only did the drive appear straight away, but also we've got an identifier there for that 2242 length M2 NVMe that's on board inside there, and typing that into Google we can find out more information about that. So if we skip straight away in, I put in that model ID for that the M2 NVMe inside, and identified immediately as a Gen 3 x4 SSD inside there. Obviously it's being mounted on a smaller module there, and you can see the same USB here being mounted inside a laptop case there. But that does mean that the USB we're talking about here, has 3,000 to 4,000 megs to play with there in terms of performance numbers. Obviously, these smaller drives, they lack DRAM in many cases, and also the aperture for that USB is much shorter. But still, nonetheless, it's just a bit of a shame that we couldn't get that USB perhaps opened up to something, say a USB 4 drive there, or a USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2. Maybe that's something they'll move towards. Maybe the USB connectivity there just didn't supply the bus power passing through it to allow that. But right now, we look at SK Hynix's website. At least at the time of recording, it's not even available to purchase. Looking online, they're at the moment still promoting that Beetle drive, but the only store I could find any kind of listing for this was here on the Japanese website, where they've got both the one and the half a gig and the half a TB and a TB option. Alongside that, an odd listing here on eBay. But moving that to one side, why don't we go for something nice and easy going and easy to read right now. We're going to go for a continuous run here on AJA. Bear in mind that right now we are recording on OBS. That will almost certainly affect the write. But if we go for a 1080p 1 gig file there, keep that nice and visible, and we go ahead and start that, we're already looking at 9,000 megabytes per second there. This is a single transfer here. We're not looking at IOPS or anything like that. We are just looking at traditional throughput there And we just want to leave this running just for a little bit of time to see if oversaturation occurs there. Now, why would we want to know about oversaturation? Well, because when this drive is going to be utilized either for mainstream backups or if you're backing up larger frequency files, we are still talking about an M2 NVMe inside there, even if it is a 2242 drive there. So when we're transferring data, it's one thing to know that we've got 1 gigabyte of transfer there for a PC transfer to play with. But what's really intriguing is we want to know the sustained performance there. Obviously, as mentioned, it's a Gen 3 x 4 drive that's been encompassed inside this bottleneck of what is effectively a Gen 3 x 1 speed, if you like. So that is opening up a potential 2,000 to 3,000 megabytes per second and throttling it down into 1,000. Therefore, oversaturation is potentially not even going to happen. But even while we're going through this, we're seeing that maintained performance number there time and time again, and clearly we are fully saturating that USB connection. So let's grade things up just a little bit. Let's go to the heaviest file. This is a 5K red. Now again, do not be surprised, it's because of OBS that we see a drop there in write performance, at least initially. But let's go for that one there. But straight away, we're still seeing that performance number. Again, this is a single transfer there. So again, there is a debate there about just how much we can do. We're going to move over to another bit of software in just a moment. But overall, I'd say right now, this is a very pleasing result for this USB drive and that promised 1 gigabyte external performance number. Now, what about temperature numbers? We're still running this test. This test has now been running for the better part of a minute and a bit. So what about while this is hitting that M2 NVMe, even though there is the bottleneck, we should really think about the temperature during the course of these ongoing tests. Let's go into the graph there. And again, we've not been running the drive for a huge amount of time. As you can see, I've got a couple of other SSDs being ran here in the background. So let's kind of zoom in there just a little bit on that overall temperature and get a closer look about what exactly is happening there. Now, again, reading temperature measurements on a USB is tricksy, but still nonetheless, it's not completely impossible, and we're still seeing reasonable numbers, which is very hard to read, and we're peaking there at 32 degrees on that USB over time. So nothing too harrowing there. It is an external USB with that throttling going on with USB on that Gen 3 x 4 drive, but overall, pretty good stuff. Next up, we'll move over to ATTO Disk Benchmark here. We're going to go for a 1 gig test file there, and we're just going to go ahead and immediately hammer this drive. Just going to leave that there in the background. Again, I'm sorry to keep repeating it, but OBS is something to at least factor in during the course of these tests. But still, nonetheless, it's going to be interesting to see the ATTO consistent measurements here. Do bear in mind that you tend to find ATTO Disk Benchmark scores around 10% less on average for a single transfer compared with that of AJA. But what I'm going to do now is fast forward just to the result of this 1 gig test, maybe even throw in another one as well. Looking at the results, again, the drive did fully sustain that performance all the way through. As you can see there on the left-hand side of the screen, we saw that full saturation of read at 1,000 megabytes per second, pretty early doors, and in terms of the write, very high numbers indeed. And when I repeated those same tests with other larger and smaller file types, such as 1/4 gigabyte and over here at 4 gigabyte, you can see those numbers were pretty consistent all the way through the test there, which is really good to see on a drive like this. So next up, let's do some Windows transfer tests. So what about a standard Windows transfer? Let's face it, it's a USB drive. You're going to use this drive for either local backups or day-to-day transferring of data, right? That's just going to sit in your pocket. Well, let's just hit that. It's exactly where it hurts. We're going to go straight into the download section here. We're going to right-click all of that. As you can see, this is right now 19.7 gigabytes of data comprising 197 files over 12 folders. So what we can do is copy that there, open up the additional drive, there's our T31, and just straight away copy that data over and take a little look at what speed that is going to be. Again, we're starting low, but we're seeing no megabytes per second performance number leap up quite significantly there. Again, when we're never going to see full saturation on a Windows transfer because of then the scale of files, unlike the synthetic transfers that we were doing earlier on, where it was a controlled file size. This is all over the place, with some files being in the hundreds of megabytes and other ones being in the tens of kilobytes there. But again, a consistent number there of 6,000 sorry, 650 megabytes per second. Pretty good there, but again, we are definitely seeing some of those smaller files. Ultimately, I'm quite pleased with the number we're seeing now. Not really seeing anything to be concerned with, really. Again, just some of those INI files there. If we move into the video files, transfer those over. We'll look at some chunkier files there and just transfer those over just to see what that larger blocky data looks like there in a transfer. And again, we're still seeing that cap there of 650. So again, whether that is a limitation of the local system we're doing there, but we're certainly seeing that peak there of 650, something to look into. But for now, let's continue our testing. And over to the PlayStation 5 testing. Now, you may already be aware that when it comes to PlayStation 5 games, they have to run from the internal SSD. You can store them on an external drive, but when it comes to playing them, you have to play those from an internal NVMe SSD or the system's own storage. But when it comes to PlayStation 4 titles, it's a different story. You can run those, store them, both of that, from an external USB drive. And in this case, the SK Hynix T31 appeared and was easy to format straight away. It appeared in the drive manager, as you can see there. So the first thing we wanted to do was go ahead and transfer some data. We went ahead with 4 titles, transferring just a little over 100 gig, and this was transferring over from the PlayStation's own internal SSD, which has a read speed of 7,000 megabytes per second, and that's transferring it over to the SSD. Now, the SSD running at 1,000 megabytes per second, or 1 gigabyte, it took 4 minutes 56 seconds to transfer from the internal drive onto that T31. I will also highlight as well to keep in mind that the PlayStation does use its own kind of compaction and its security encryption on a lot of the data, and this can often form as a massive bottleneck when transferring data. We've covered that in previous SSD testing for PS5, but it transferred over in just shy of 5 minutes there. Now, when it came to the games testing themselves, unfortunately, my capture card, you can see here very shortly on screen, wasn't greatly optimized for this. I'd already been utilizing it for a few other tests. So unfortunately, it resulted in a drop in that frame rate and that noisy distortion there on the graphics. Now, none of that, I repeat, none of that is to do with the console itself or the drive. It is just my capture card there. But nevertheless, I just wanted to include it to show that the games I tested here, and in particular Batman Arkham Knight and Dark Souls 3, ran absolutely fine. The load times were even just a fraction quicker than loading them from the PlayStation 4 originally. I had these games on a PS4 Pro, and the PS4 Pro arrived with a SATA SSD. Indeed, if you had the original PS4, that had a SATA hard drive. Nevertheless, that meant that regardless of the hard drive, which would hit around 200 megs a second, and the SATA SSD, which would hit around 500 to maximum 550 megabytes per second, both of those were outdone by that 1 gigabyte or 1,000 megabytes per second on offer from the T31 there. And that's why we saw those slight incremental improvements in loading there of each of those individual games. So transferring the data back from the SSD, because we want to look at read and write performance, it took a little bit longer, it has to be said. The PlayStation 5's internal SSD has a write speed of, I believe, around 4,500 to 5,000 megabytes per second there. And unfortunately, because of that encryption, because of the way data packets are handled, it's not a conventional transfer as you'd find on the PC. So the transfer back from the SSD, from the external USB onto the PlayStation, took 14 minutes and 5 seconds. Again, not the fault of the USB here at all, just simply the case when transferring data to and from the PlayStation's internal drive. But ultimately, all of this added up to an external drive there over USB that I would definitely happily recommend for storing and, of course, playing your PlayStation 4 titles from. And although you can, once again, install PS5 titles on this SSD, you can't utilize it for playing those PS5 drives. But ultimately, the results from this and the results from our PC benchmarking there all add up to me to a drive here that is definitely suitable for traditional storage there. Now, is it worth the price it's arriving at? Not quite, I would say, at launch. Definitely the RRP on this drive is a fraction high, but I would argue for the convenience of a very compact SSD that fits in your pocket, that's giving you guaranteed 1 gigabyte data transfer per second, requiring no external bus power and running from an internal NVMe inside from a brand you trust, I'm happy with that, and I would still recommend it if you want to spend the extra few quid now on a more reliable drive, and particularly when you look at, I hate seagulls, the range of different kinds of external SSD over USB in the market right now. It's actually kind of refreshing to see a drive that just does what it says it will do. But this has been a review of the T31 from SK Hynix. Thank you so much for watching. There should be a link in the description to other resources on USB drives, as well as some PlayStation 5 testing and where you can get hold of this drive in a few different retailers. If you're going to go to those shops anyway, it really helps us out at the channel if you use those links, because everything that's raised from there via fees, via affiliated links there, result in us carrying on doing what we do. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.